if you look at the historical trajectory, starting with Jesus of Nazareth, you start to see an increasingly institutional, strong, imperial expression of who Jesus was and what his message was and what the gospel is and what the Christian religion is, right? So you begin with, the historical Jesus. The earliest of the canonical gospels is the Gospel of Mark. Now, of course, these gospels were written anonymously. They didn't have names attached to them. And at some point, maybe I'll do a series on hermeneutics and interpreting this stuff and flesh some of this stuff a bit more in a bit more detail. But the earliest of the canonical gospels is the Gospel of Mark, which is written probably in the mid-60s or so. So about 30 plus years after the crucifixion of Jesus, Mark's gospel came out. And in Mark's gospel, if you're just reading Mark's gospel, it's weird for us today because you go buy a Bible and it's all bound together as a single volume, right? And so you get the impression that that's how it came, to the earliest Christians, but that's not the case. Each of these books was written, and then they were talked about and copied, and the message of them spread by word of mouth. But if you had just read the Gospel of Mark and you didn't have any of the other background knowledge, Mark has no birth narrative. Mark has no shepherds and angels and, no room in the inn and born in the manger. None of that exists in Mark. Mark just begins with Jesus's public ministry. You also have no post-resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Gospel famously has an extended ending that almost all scholars will say was added later by some other scribe that wasn't written by the original Gospel writer, whose name we don't even know, by the way. Tradition tells us it was Mark, but that wasn't really the case for the first 150 years or so of the Christian church. At no point did anyone refer to, when they quoted one of the Gospels, they didn't say like Matthew says this or Luke says this. They just said our Lord said, blessed are the meek. But it wasn't until like 180, I think, that anyone actually attributed a name to any of the Gospels they quoted. As the story progresses, then you get Luke and Matthew, which were written the next two of the canonical Gospels. There are also plenty of Gnostic Gospels too. That the Gnostic Gospels are puzzling, and the whole reason why I'll get into why we even call them Gnostic Gospels, because that itself is an interesting issue to look into. Once you get to Matthew and Luke, which were written after Mark, and most scholars think they used Mark as source material, as well as whoever Mark used as source material, they used that too. But then you start getting, Jesus becomes a bigger figure in Matthew and in Luke, because you've got these birth narratives that are miraculous in nature. You've got wise men from the east following the star. You've got angels in the sky appearing to shepherds as they watch their flocks by night, and the whole Christmas story, right? And you get not only an empty tomb, because Mark, as I said, has no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. There is an empty tomb in Mark, but that's where it ends. In Matthew and Luke, you actually get appearances of the risen Christ to women, to the disciples, and so you get a more fully orbed, fleshed out, if you will, description of the resurrection as the story progresses. Okay? Once you get to John, all of a sudden, and John wasn't written until the end of the first century. John was written sometime in the 90s. But once you get to the Gospel of John, now you've got, because it's bizarre to think about this, because we, as I said, usually come to this with all the knowledge in our head, or at least what we've picked up from growing up in church or whatever, and we just think that we read Mark as though Mark has John in mind, and we read Mark as though the original readers of Mark knew all the stuff that John said too, but that's not the case. As I said, John wasn't written until 30 some odd years after Mark, and Mark wasn't written for 30 some odd years after Jesus had died. When you get to John, suddenly you've got the idea that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed before he was born. You don't get that in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all you know is that Jesus is an apocalyptic preacher who was born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth in Galilee, but there's no sense that he existed before he was born. But in John, you've got this idea that no, the Word was God. This Logos, the second person of the Trinity, assumed a human body and human nature and incarnated. Okay? The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, it says in John 1:14. This is new information. Okay? This is not information that any of the Synoptic Gospels or the Gnostic Gospels relayed, right? And so the story of Jesus becomes more and more profound, miraculous, supernatural as time goes on, okay? And so we're moving from a sort of simple narrative to one that's very, very strong and imperial, okay? So you've got the apocalyptic preacher who is crucified by Pontius Pilate and whose tomb is empty in Mark. Suddenly you've got the miraculous events surrounding his birth in Matthew and Luke, and the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus alive from the dead in Matthew and Luke. Then when you get to John, you've got this idea of the pre-existence of Jesus, to the point where he says in John 8, before Abraham was, I am. In other words, I existed before Abraham ever did, right? So going all the way back. So you've got this, like a pebble thrown into a still pool, the concentric circles getting wider and wider, and the story becoming more and more supernatural and, I would argue, strong and imperial. Eventually, you get an idea of what's called the church, okay? Jesus only used the term church a couple of times, most famously in Matthew 16, where he said, to the disciples, who do men say that I am? And they say, oh, some say you're, Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist come back from the dead. Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says, and a lot of scholars think that this portion was added later, that it wasn't original to the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I say that to you that you are Peter. So I'm renaming you Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Okay, so now you've got this concept, which scholars think was added after Matthew to the Gospel of Matthew, whoever wrote it, that Jesus is forming an institution. Okay, because until this, you don't really get in the Gnostic Gospels and in the rest of the Synoptic Gospels, you don't get any notion of a church, because as I said, Jesus was this apocalyptic preacher who everyone thought was going to return in their lifetime, because Jesus said he would. Jesus said, this generation will not, pass until all these things are fulfilled. There are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God, right? And so everyone thought that the kingdom would be inaugurated in their lifetime. And that's why scholars think that the idea of an institutional church that will remain for hundreds, if not thousands of years, was added later, because it became clear at a certain point, especially after the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, that he didn't come back. All right, so maybe we need to prep ourselves for the long game. Okay, maybe we got to take the long view of this. And so that's why some scholars think that material was added to the Gospel of Matthew to give us the idea that Jesus intended all along for a church to emerge, right? That he would build, that he would put St. Peter in charge of on some level, whatever that means, and that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And so very, very early on, you have this development among the Christian community that there is an institution. The institution is headquartered in Rome, that the Bishop of Rome is the successor of St. Peter, just like all of the Christian bishops are successors of the apostles. And we can do a talk sometime about where that idea comes from. But very soon you've got a hierarchical institution that exists, And of course, this is before Constantine, and so it's still underground, and it doesn't have the kind of flex and the kind of imperial swagger that it would one day get. But nevertheless, by the end of the 1st century into the 2nd century, you've got this institutionalizing of what at the beginning seemed to be a very radical apocalyptic message. It's slowly becoming more and more hierarchical, more and more institutional, more and more rigid, and eventually more and more imperial. Because as we know, in the 4th century, with Constantine, the Christian religion ceases to be this outlaw, ragtag, underground sect, and it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, right? Constantine is converted, and he not only makes Christianity legal and lists it, but he actually makes it the official religion of the empire. And so that's when you've got, you've got imperial might, you've got an army, you've got all the authority you could want, all in the service of this religion. So now you've got, the sword of the Spirit and the actual sword coming together, right? State, the church and the state are now one, and you've got the most literal expression of imperial religion, of empire, of Christianity as empire.